So we're going to take 2 classes now to look at Heart of Darkness, which is a novella, just like in terms of form, the one we just read, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, but a little bit later than that, and it is published a little later as well. It's published in 1899, and it tells the story of a man by the name of Charles Marlowe, who's a steamboat captain who is navigating the Congo River in Africa, going into the middle of the center of Africa. And it's a very complex novella, and it is often, it's a sort of a flashpoint for debates about all manners of things, from racism to colonialism to post-colonialism. It's a text that is repeatedly cited. The Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe objects to its portrait of the Africans, says that it's racist, it denies the Africans any sort of sense of agency and rationality and so forth, which I think is true, but I also think it misses the point that the portrait is there not necessarily to commend the view, but rather to critique it, potentially at any rate. You could see it as a straightforward racist text in the portrait, and you might not be incorrect about that, but there's sufficient complexity and ambiguity to the story that makes you question, among other things, the narrator's perspective in the story. So here's a problem in this novella which we haven't encountered thus far, other than in the satire by Jonathan Swift, where we don't trust the narrator. We don't trust those in authority. In the case of Swift's A Modest Proposal, we saw that he was, although calling it a modest proposal, counseling the eating of babies, and not only the eating of babies, but the industry of eating babies by paying women to have their babies and to suckle them to a year's age so that they become nutritious and healthy and good value and all this sort of thing, and dismisses objections of doing it for a longer period because of the cost and the time and all sorts of things. In other words, dismissing pragmatic objections, in part because he's entertaining pragmatic objections and he sees things only on a pragmatic scale. So he's actually critiquing the view of human nature as a commodity and pragmatic considerations and numbering them and so forth, and all of it's in the language of computation. And I said to you that that theme of reducing human nature to a commodity was one of the main areas of interest and critique in the literature of the 18th century and onwards. It doesn't go away. As the age of modern science is the backdrop for the Western world and the text that we're going to look at, we'll find that the writers, while they reflect that world, are also strong critics of it. And the best writers are the best critics of it. And we're going to be looking at further iterations of this when we come to the dystopian novels of the 20th century, 1984 and Brave New World. These are not commending the view, they're actually presenting it as a horror scenario, but it's a horror scenario that we actually live in. And here, likewise, in Heart of Darkness, I think Conrad, it's difficult to see him commending the view that he presents. I think it's a little bit more sophisticated than that, or a little bit more complicated than that. But he is, without a doubt, speaking against the backdrop of racism and of colonialism and of exploitation and of the problem of moral authority in the context of that. Because the Western world is the enlightened world, right? Coming out of the Enlightenment's place of light. Africa is dark Africa, not just in the sense that we have people with dark skin, but in the sense that it's not enlightened. It doesn't follow it's not yet come up to the industrial age and isn't educated in the same way. It hasn't seen the light of reason, and the methodology of the Western world has not yet been brought to Africa. So in that sense, not yet enlightened, in that sense dark. That's clearly there, and it's one of the themes of the whole novella. And I think we can see that Joseph Conrad gives us reason to not trust the Western perspective, while at the same time having a narrator who, while sympathetic to this portrait, is not reliable himself and starts to become morally compromised. The further he goes in to the heart of Africa, into the Congo, the more his judgment is clouded, and the more we are disorientated ourselves as the readers. And if you found it hard to read, that's not because he's a bad writer. It's because the disorientation is intentional on his part. He's trying to show how reason actually lacks integrity when it has a certain view of human nature, which is dehumanizing. And the dehumanization doesn't only apply to the Africans, it also applies to what happens to those that work for the company, furthermore. And we'll look at that as well. So dehumanization is certainly one of the main themes here, even against the backdrop of imperialism and colonialism. And darkness becomes a metaphor not only for the lack of progress or the lack of enlightenment, but also probably it has, although it's never specified in these terms, has Christian connotations of sin and corruption. So darkness in that sense. Scripture speaks of darkness in that sense. The heart being wicked, the heart being of all things deceitful. And so the title of the novella, The Heart of Darkness, begs the question, what do we mean, or what does Conrad mean by the heart of darkness? What is it? This little image here has a heart in the background. It also has a man in the foreground, or rather something like a man, but more of a skeleton than anything. And a rather emaciated man at best, perhaps, and rather demonic in some ways. And whose heart is so dark? Is it the continent? Because it's a possibility. We're going to look at the continent and the portrait of Africa on the maps. It will have a white center. I'm going to show you an image here. Actually, I want to do it right now. This is Africa 1880 versus Africa 1913. After the so-called Scramble for Africa takes place amongst the European powers, there was a time when, and you can't see it here, that the center in Africa would have been the white spot. And that, remember, he's writing this in 1899. I probably should have an image from 1899. It's an area where the jungle is so thick that there's no way of mapping it. Remember, they don't have GPS or anything like that. They have to literally go in and explore it and see what's there, etc. And in the center of the Congo, which is a Belgian territory, where the Belgians, they are the purple ones, or the magenta. Ooh, got that right, magenta. That's the Congo, and it's occupied by Belgium. And the Belgians are sending Charles Marlowe to get something from the jungle. What are they seeking? They're seeking ivory. Now, ivory is in some sense, a symbol of Western civilization. We use it for the keys of a piano. We use it for combs and so forth. It's a rather odd thing. It comes from the tusks of elephants. Very much prized in areas of the world where there are not elephants, particularly. But it's a symbol of fine art, of culture, of civilization. Remember, the piano is a pretty late developing instrument. They have harpsichords in the 18th century. Piano is a new one. It doesn't pluck it. Well, you know how pianos work if you ever opened one up. So it symbolizes something, and it symbolizes something of civilization that the civilized world gets it at the expense of the unenlightened world by exploiting the continent, taking its resources, robbing its resources. But as I say, the context here is of a scramble for Africa. Now, on the I guess it's your left, in 1880, that's what Africa looks like in terms of its allegiance to European powers, in terms of the colors here. If we want to go down here, we can see these are the different countries, European countries represented by, and some of them are not Europeanized and have slightly different colors here. But in general, come 1913, at the onset of the First World War, the entirety of Africa has been colonized in the name of the king of the country that took it. This is a so-called Scramble for Africa. And the Scramble for Africa took place over the course of the 19th century, but it accelerated over the course of time. As you can see, even in 1880, there's a great deal of Africa. Now, what's here in North Africa and Northeast Africa, this is long, if you look at the Roman Empire, this has long been known to the Western world. When I say the Western world, I'm talking about the Roman Empire even. And would have been fallen under the influence of various colonial powers, from the Romans to Islam, to different European powers, the British, etc., at different periods. At this stage, I think it's the Italians that occupy Egypt and Tripolitania, but I might be wrong about that. Or is it the Ottoman Turks? No, it's the Ottoman Turks until the British took it. And the Algerians are the French, and the Moroccan, who would be the Moroccans here? They're their own thing for this time, till the French conquer. The whole of West Africa becomes French. To this day, in West Africa, French is spoken as the educated language, etc., alongside whatever native languages are spoken here. Likewise, in East Africa and in South Africa, English is spoken. In the Congo, it will be Belgian that's spoken. In certain other areas, let's say the grayish areas, there will be German. There. And so on and so on. Ethiopian will be Italian, I believe. Or Spanish. Sorry? Yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on here. And it depends on when you take the picture of the map and the time, but it's contested territory, yeah. So this is just taken at the 1913 is helpful because it's just before the First World War breaks out. But you can see that at that point, pretty much the majority is going to be conquered colonial territory. But in 1899, which is when the novella is written, there is still parts of Africa that have not yet been colonized, and the specific area we're interested in is the magenta. Is it the magenta? Is that magenta? I don't know. Yeah? I'm always pleased with myself when I get a color right like that. That's the Congo, and it's white on the map. The rest is not. Is colored, but here we have a white splotch in the middle. But in the middle of the whiteness there, where the white ivory is extracted, it's terra incognita. Nobody knows what's going on there, because the jungle is a very dangerous place. Lots of insects, mosquitoes, and so forth that'll give you fevers, etc. It's hot. It's impenetrable. It's hard to see. The jungle makes even the bright sun it's hard to penetrate there, and so forth. So it's symbolic. Is that then the heart of darkness? In one sense, it could be just the area. But I don't think Conrad, and he doesn't answer the question, by the way. The title begs the question, what do we mean by the heart of darkness? Is it the African who has the heart of darkness? Because they've not yet been enlightened. They don't follow civilized ways. They are not yet industrious. They seem rather lazy, etc., the way they're portrayed in the novel. Is that the heart of darkness? Or could it also be the sending European powers that are doing the colonizes, do they possess the heart of darkness? Or is it perhaps, in a sense, all of the above? Conrad doesn't answer the question that I've posed. He just presents it as the title. It begs the question. There's an ambiguity about it, and the ambiguity is intentional. He's not going to resolve it. When you're a teacher, people expect you to explain things for them so that they understand it. And it's my responsibility to some degree to try and make things clearer, but I can't make clearer what's deliberately ambiguous and opaque. It's deliberately so, and it's meant to be so. You're meant to be disoriented. And so there's a shift, to go back to what I said about Swift's modest proposal. There it is clear, there's a clear sense of right and wrong, and satire can take place because there's a standard of humanity which his audience understands. When he says that this is wrong, and certain religious concepts and nationalist concepts, etc., he expects his audience to be with him and to be rebuked by the satire. This is not a satirical novella. It's not satirizing. It's expressing the ambiguity that comes from a colonialist enterprise done in the name of civilization that really has lost the motive for civilization. And I will say the motive for civilization is Christianity. It's lost it. I remember I talked about this in relation to Tennyson. The context of the British Empire is that a huge power has suddenly been afforded to Europe, little Europe. If you look on a global scale, Europe is not doesn't have a large landmass. What it does have is centuries, millennia of Christendom changing it, but come the Enlightenment, there's a movement away from that. A sort of loss of faith in Christian reason in favor of pure reason. So reason purified of Christianity. Christianity that had probably discredited itself to some degree because of clergy abuse and religious wars internally and so forth, and that sort of thing. But by the time the mid-19th century takes place, Europe is a very different place than it was even in the mid-18th century, when we have the big great revivals of Whitefield and the Wesleys and so forth. The backdrop there. By the mid-19th century, we face a world in Europe that is losing its faith in Christian orthodoxy. They don't believe the Bible. And in its place, they're trying to deal with the reality of an educational world that was predicated on the truth of the Christian faith. It was predicated on the university is a Christian institution. It's a medieval institution. It arises in the context of Christendom. It's not there in the ancient world. It depends on what I said in a lecture, which you haven't heard, but it occurred to me on feminism I gave the other day, which is modern feminism says that women only started getting rights in the 19th century, and before that they were effectively treated like property, like chattel, like slaves, etc., and had no rights or privileges, which is just simply false and goes directly against the history of Europe, where women had property rights, could inherit, where there was a death penalty for rape, where women were, while part of the domestic sphere rather than the public sphere, by and large, it's not like they had no rights. They just didn't have the right to vote. So the suffrage movement is the right to vote, be involved in politics, but every other right is already there under the law. Women are considered to be image bearers of God. They're, because of the biblical law that's brought into the Western world under the Justinian Code, if you're interested, in the 6th century, and it applied throughout the Roman Empire. Promoted by a woman by the name of Theodora, the Empress Theodora, if you've never heard of her. Very interesting woman. She was a prostitute, converted, and some say that she was the main motivation for the Justinian Code. Her husband, Justinian, gets the code named after him, but she is the one who moves for giving prostitutes rights even, and refuges from it and so forth. Very interesting. But that then tends to characterize the whole of Europe. Women have rights. They bear the image of God. Come this period, human nature starts no longer being seen in terms of personhood. It starts being seen in terms of autonomy. And it has scientific basis for determining personhood, which don't actually have enough moral fiber there to resist the idea that people can be commodified. That's what we saw in Swift's modest proposal. We start talking about people as inconvenient and threats because they're Catholic, and there's a Catholic problem. We had to solve the Catholic problem. There are too many breeding Catholics. We need to solve this problem. How are we going to do it, etc. It's a very dehumanizing way of speaking. That accelerates over the course of time. By the mid-19th century, we have a theory of human nature that had not ever been entertained since the ancient world, and even there, not the way it was entertained, and by which I mean Darwin's view of human nature. The view of human nature as having evolved from animals, and before that from lesser animal being, from the primordial goo. Deep back in time, long back in history. It went from the goo, and then it ended up in the zoo, and then it ends up with you. Right? There's a sort of a trajectory. And the narrative that it begins in the goo is there's no evidence for it, because there can't be evidence for it, or if there was evidence for it, there's no record of it, because it would have to be written, and only civilized people write records, and the evidence for those civilizations is only a few thousand years old, that they have recorded testimony to things going on around them. But that's not enough of a timeline to prove the hypothesis that humanity had evolved over the courses of a very long time, millions of years, and so the idea that the earth is older than the account in scripture gains currency to justify the theory. That's why it comes about. And then there's all sorts of dating. I don't want to get into the creationist stuff and so forth. I'm just giving you an explanation for why this comes about. And in accordance with that, you may be wondering where I'm going with this, and this is the insidious part of it, the different, if we originate in the goo and then go, as I say, to the zoo, to the animals and the apes, and then eventually to mankind, and we look at human beings as a species that is evolving, not only evolving, but that evolution progresses through the survival of the fittest, because that's the mechanism that Darwin proposes, then the question is, who are the fittest who are going to survive? How do we identify that group? What will make them the fittest to survive? What will be the measure of their fitness? And the obvious answer would be scientific attainment. Because science is like the scientific implements of technology and so forth, were unknown in the ancient world. They clearly distinguish us from our forebears. We have boats, they have boats, yes, but our boats are bigger, faster, better. We have a steam engine by the mid-19th century. Things are electrified. There's industrialization, etc. Nowadays we have, smart technology, all this sort of stuff. The technology is smart, and you're dumb for using it. It's called a smartphone. It's not called a smart you that uses the phone. It's a phone smart. Social media will let you use it for free because you are the commodity being sold on it. No such thing as a free lunch. They'll let you use the software, yes, but then they're marketing all of your vitals to companies that are going to market to you. And they're going to sell your identity with your consent, because they have to approve of it when you sign up for the social media companies. But in the context of that, and as I said, the question is of who is the fittest, it becomes very clear in the writers of the day that the fittest are the whites, who are called Caucasians, from where they allegedly originated, the Caucasus Mountains, which is sort of southwest Asia, if you will. It's the Caucasus Mountains. And there are two other groups. There's the Negroids, and then there's the Mongoloids. And the Mongoloids from the Mongolian Empire and so forth, Genghis Khan and so forth. So in other words, basically what we would call Asians, Africans, and Europeans. But those are the designations. And then which of the three is the fittest to survive? Well, in white Europe, it becomes very plain that it is, in fact, the Europeans that are the fittest to survive. And therefore, it is justified in some ways that they should colonize the earth. It's justified. In a book called The History of Creation by Ernst Haeckel, let me put this up here and see if I can find this. There he is. Go away. Stay signed out. History of Creation, or the development of the earth and its inhabitants by the action of natural causes, doctrine of evolution in general, and that of Darwin, Goethe, and Lamarck in particular, from the German of Ernst Haeckel, etc., written in 1876. So before Heart of Darkness is written. Haeckel will claim that there are 12 races of men, and are differentiated in accordance with certain physical appearances, etc. And these are the descendants of the tribes of Noah. So Noah has 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And Japheth, I think, is the one who goes up into Europe. And Ham goes east, and Shem is in the Middle East and down into Africa. And the Japhethites, I just made that up, I don't even know if that's the word, are the most worthy to survive. Why? Because they have certain technological abilities, etc., scientific abilities. The Semites from Shem are the religious peoples. That will be the Jews, and then the Muslims, etc. Yes, and then there's the Hamites. I don't know if they're, I'm making that up, the Hamites. But that descendant is not as fit to survive, demonstrated by a technical. So it's appeal to science. Science will demonstrate, and statistics and measurements and the power to gain authority over the earth and dominion over the earth through science will be the proof positive of fitness. The Olympic Games is revived. What year are the Olympic Games brought back on? The old Olympian Games of the ancient Greek world? Does anyone know? I believe it's 1899. What's the purpose of the Olympic Games? Different nations competing against other. Why? Demonstrate fitness. Becomes a sort of a competition to demonstrate. It becomes very important in terms of nationalism, national pride, national identity, etc. It's a measure of it. It becomes a political thing. It is to this day. But in the history of creation by Haeckel, he describes blacks, just as Darwin does, by the way, as being, he says, Darwin writes, the Caucasian race was further from the apes than other supposed lower races. It's further advanced from it, and therefore the most fit to survive. Now, you will not hear this in public schools which are inclusive and affirming and et cetera, who will affirm Darwinism as the view of science that cannot be contested. But it is the basis for racist judgments. And it's the context for colonialism, Now, colonialism tends to be associated with nationalism, which it is, but it's rooted in a scientific theory. And I just wanted to bring it to your attention here. And if you want to look at Haeckel, go do that on your own. I'm not going to spend my time doing that here because it'll distract me too far from the novella. But it seems to me that Conrad, when he writes this, by the way, Conrad's a fascinating man, because although he writes in English, he was not born in England, he was born in Poland. English is his second language. And he was a mariner himself. He was a sailor, spent much of his life on the sea. And his protagonist here, Charles Marlowe, he appears in more than one novel of his. And one thing that people usually assume of the main character, that the main character represents the author and his views and is unambiguously representing him. And anyone who's an artist, an author will say, well, just because my characters say it doesn't mean that I think it. That's what a character of that type would. And I like this particular character because this character seems to represent something important, a type of individual, but that doesn't mean that it represents Conrad's views. When people who are very poor at writing write characters, they put themselves in the novel, and the character reflects exactly what they think about the world. That's not what good writers do. They have characters for a reason, and good writers are able to present plausible characters based on their knowledge of how people work. So Shakespeare is brilliant at it, so is Dickens, and so is Dostoevsky, and so is Tolstoy. Great insight into human character and motivation, etc. Very believable for the rest of us. But that doesn't mean that he actually agrees with Ivan Illich, for instance. It doesn't mean he agrees with Charles Marlowe. So when the Africans are described in the way that they are by Charles Marlowe, that doesn't mean that Conrad is endorsing it, believes it, or in any way expects us to do anything other than to question it. So if Chinua Achebe, the Nigerian novelist, doesn't like the portrait of Africans, that's good. You're not supposed to like it, I don't think. I think you're supposed to find it morally questionable. That's my reading of it. But again, this is a novel upon which it's very difficult to be authoritative because it's deliberately ambiguous, and you can make a case from multiple sides on it. As I said, it's difficult to read. I don't want that. I want the PDF. Any comments or questions? I want to present that as what on earth? Gutenberg? Yeah. Is it? Oh yes, I've used this one before, you're right. No? No comments? No questions?